And now, let me introduce Ben Davis. First of all, can I share the news, the good news about Texas?
Sure,
it's
sure.
Official already?
Yeah, it is.
Can I do it? So Ben just got an offer from the Texas A&M University, and he will start
August.
in August. So congratulations. So Benjamin Davis is the author of a couple of great books. One is Choose Your Bearing on Glissant, Human Rights and Decolonial Ethics. This is the book. He's the editor of another volume that I will use next academic year in my course approaches on critical theory and the canon. And the book is Creolizing Critical Theory, New Voices in Caribbean Philosophy. Let me see, how can I show to the people? Yes, this is the book. And he's also the author of a great book on Simone Weil. Simone Weil, Political Philosophy. This is actually where I met Ben. So it was a fantastic conference in St. Louis. And we had 2 days of intense conversation on Simone Weil. Okay, so the paper, the talk is offering us today is titled Opacity and Voice in Édouard Glissant and José María Arguedas. You have the floor. Yes. What?
Thank you, Max. Very good to be here with everyone and in this department, the work of which I followed for a long time, reading Angela Davis and James Clifford, but also now reading, I learned a lot from Bonner's book on theory and practice and bringing those together. So it's really good to be here. Hi to Rob as well on Zoom. Good to see you after a number of years. So I'll talk today for maybe around 40 minutes about questions of identity and difference and the relationship between ethics and politics. But I hope you'll forgive that I'll tell it in a bit more of a story. My talk is called Opacity and Voice in Édouard Glissant and José María Arguedas. A number of years ago now, during the summer of 2015, I was doing 2 things that would, I can say, looking back, determine the course of events for some time afterward. The first was that I was studying the ethical theory of the Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel, very slowly reading each page of his important and difficult book, Ethics of Liberation. The second was that I was living among the Shukuru people in northeastern Brazil, trying to understand the Shukuru's metaphysics that reflected their people's history, their traditions that they have cultivated across centuries in what we now call Brazil, a mix of land-based, indigenous, African, Catholic, and European theories and practices. Right before I left Brazil, I needed to ask the leader of the Shukuru, Cacique Marcos, a question that I had been spinning around in my head. Marcos and I had been communicating for a few weeks across his Portuguese and my accented Spanish. He had been telling me the story of his people, about the Encantados, the ancestral spirits that inform Shukuru life long after the burial of ancestors' bodies, about how his father played a large role in reviving Shukuru cultural traditions as part of a larger resurgence of indigenous activism that led to changes in 1988 to Brazil's constitution, about how his father was assassinated as a result of this activism, and about how he had survived multiple assassination attempts himself. We also talked about the Shukuru's ongoing litigation around regaining their ancestral land rights. And we talked about much more ordinary things: soccer teams, dive watches, coffee, or families. Before I left Shukuru land, I asked Cacique Marcos my pressing question, which concerned the responsibility I had in carrying the stories of his people that he shared with me. In our neoliberal times, when everything has become commodified, I adhere to the perhaps outdated belief that knowledge, while meant to be shared as widely as possible, also comes with responsibility. This is the question of what the philosopher of law, Wendy Salkin, has called speaking for others. Because I had been reading Dussel, I expected Marcos to say that his knowledge was not mine to share, that in facing what Dussel describes as exteriority, drawing on what the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas called alterity, the radical heterogeneity of the other that is absolutely other, infinitely transcendent, infinitely foreign, the best I could do was to dwell with the depths of my infinite responsibility to the Shukuru people in their irreducible singularity, their complete illegibility. But Marcos advised a much more common, much more political path. He said, share the story of the Shukuru and defend similar struggles. I was surprised by this answer. It went against much of how I had understood a tradition of continental ethics, from Levinas through Derrida to many contemporary theorists who maintain a Levinasian vocabulary of alterity, rupture, radicality, and the capital O, other. If sharing the story of the Shukuru was to become part of my ethical practice, was to become part of the responsibility I had asked Marcos to help me understand, then I needed to think about ethics differently. And I was left largely at a loss because I also knew that Marcos's suggestion still implied a deep respect for our cultural differences, which nevertheless we could somewhat communicate to each other. That perhaps strange conjuncture of reading Dussel and living with the Shukuru left me with the philosophical question that animates this talk, namely, how can moral and political philosophy articulate a sense of collective humanity that does not obscure difference, but instead rethinks difference beyond relations domination? Indeed, I was left wondering how to think ethics and politics together. In other words, how to think cultural difference and international legal struggle together. At that moment, a number of years ago now, my first step was to return with a new sense of purpose to the writings of the Martinican poet and philosopher Édouard Glissant, whose concept of a right to opacity would become key for how, as I began to realize, ethics and politics could, perhaps should, be linked in responding to the most pressing social problems of our time. For Glissant, who advances the right to opacity across his theoretical corpus, from his earlier and more overtly political book, Le Discours Antillais, to his final, more ecologically oriented book, Philosophie de la Relation, Glissant still gives us a very strong concept of difference in offering what he called opacity. In Glissant, opacity checks against a drive to understand as a way of domination. He describes this drive in the original French in terms of comprendre, which better reveals a dual sense of knowledge and control, understanding via grasping, than the English to understand or to know. By Glissant's lights, quite simply, some parts of other cultures will remain opaque to those not from those cultures. They will resist comprehension. But, I think this is important, relation remains possible and ideal. And in this respect, he gives the example of how the French anthropologist Jacques Burke wrote about Islam. Burke's scholarship on Islam was that of a Catholic writing about a tradition not his own. But Burke, Glissant writes, saw in Islam its rationality, but also its mystique. What does this mean? Glissant goes on, if not that he believes that every conceptualization has its corresponding poetics. Burke was born in 1910 in Algeria, then a French colony to French parents. His father worked in the French colonial administration. At an early age, Burke became fluent in Arabic and, although a practicing Catholic, spent his life among Muslims, culminating in his translation of the Quran into French, a translation he qualified as only an attempt at translation, thus acknowledging the Quran's own claim to its untranslatability. Burke's ardent and consistent defense of the Muslim world, from arguing in favor of Algeria's independence to later arguing against U.S. invasions in the Middle East, led the newspaper The Guardian to describe Burke in his obituary as a very untypical pied noir. Precisely for Burke's untypicality, Glissant saw in him a deep attention to human life. As Glissant put it, Burke taught French readers that there existed an Arab modernity, and he wrote about this encounter without any manifesto, with rectitude and clarity. Glissant goes on, and this is the first quotation on your handout. This clarity in the structure of his thought and also in its expression is close to what we would call a humanism, a clarity that is forever questioning, that of the pioneer who clears the ground or the plowman. It is therefore also accompanied by an appeal to that which is blurred, to mystery, and by an anxious attention to whatever is weaving itself in the underside of the real, by an approach to the incomprehensible, the ineffable. Glissant's poetic method comes to the fore in this description of Burke's humanism. He praises Burke's attention to what is mysterious, blurred, and changing. In leaving room for mystery in Islam, Burke avoids the usual tendency to try to totally comprehend what was foreign to him. But importantly, mystery is not alterity. Burke lived in relation to a religion, not in a religious, reverent relation to Islam. He studied it, made mistakes about it, lived among its followers, and translated its most sacred text. I am spending so much time talking about how Glissant reads Burke in order to draw out a key point in Glissant's articulation of a right to opacity, namely, the fact that other cultures remain and will remain opaque to us does not at all imply that there should not be exchange and engagement. It is not a separatism. For Glissant, there will and should be exchanges across peoples, and these exchanges will always be imperfect, and indeed might first always include harm, because as humans we are imperfect beings who often misread others. We are opaque to one another, but, he would remind us, in relation, in dialogue, in exchange, whether in studying each other's traditions, doing business with each other, insulting one another, or, more rarely, in Burke's case, praying with one another. So that is opacity in Glissant. Unlike Levinas's absolute difference, it is always relative. Whereas Levinas stresses an absolute break, Glissant stresses connection. Not similarity, but connection, contact, entanglement. And Glissant is emphatic that opacity is not obscurity. He presents entanglements that are forged by human contacts, which can and often do go poorly, as Levinas worries about the calculations and violence of what he calls politics. But contacts that also can and often do go well, as when Burke prayed with Muslims or Glissant read and loved the novels of William Faulkner. If that is opacity, a difference that is relative, as opposed to alterity, a difference that is absolute, then does it matter that Glissant, throughout his corpus, situated this sense of difference in a rights claim? I think it does. As I have stressed over and over in response to readings of Glissant that turn his opacity into a new alterity, he does not merely articulate opacity as a sense of difference. Again and again, he calls it a right to opacity. So how does this rights claim affect how we read his sense of difference? My own reading is that by situating opacity within a rights claim, Glissant is situating ethics within a larger politics. This sounds strange, perhaps even wrong, to much of Anglo-American philosophy and legal theory, which tends to maintain a separation between these realms of life. A separation not maintained, for instance, in Islamic law, which is perhaps a hint at why Glissant turns to Burke in the first place. This situation of ethics within politics is a great departure from Levinas's trajectory and vocabulary, and it is also thus a departure from the vocabulary that Enrique Dussel, from his earlier writings on the Bible to his developed ethics of liberation, took up. And so it is also a departure from the wider line of Latin American philosophy of liberation that follows Dussel. Dussel offers a translation of alterity to exteriority, exterioridad, effectively bringing Levinas's conversation to the ground, as it were, but at the same time keeping a sense of what Dussel, in writing about Jesus and Christian prophets, called exteriority and transcendence. To use a more recent example, in a New York Times op-ed from January this year, the legal scholar Maggie Blackhawk, commenting on Martin Scorsese's new film, Killers of the Flower Moon, cited Levinas to talk about how humans are predisposed to empathy, but then noted that this theory of human life didn't really work out in the film. Blackhawk wrote, quote, Emmanuel Levinas envisioned human morality as developed in full only when an individual sees and relates to the other. It is in this moment of encounter with those wholly different from us in worldview that we experience empathy and reach the full capacity of our moral potential. End quote. But, Blackhawk went on, this approach has not been successful. The reader of both Levinas's alterity and Dussel's exteriority, who, like Blackhawk, has a view toward legal changes, ends up with all sorts of questions about how to communicate with an absolute other in order to sustain a political project, which of course requires less reverence and more communication, as well as the more ordinary tasks that sustain a movement, such as cooking food or doing the dishes or caring for children. I asked Dussel about some of this the last time I spoke to him, before his tragic passing last year, and he remained committed to the language of exteriority as well as to the importance of the state. Glissant offers a different path. He says of Burke, quote, he has always conceived of the approach to the other in a vision of solidarity with the world. I'll read it again. He has always conceived of the approach to the other in a vision of solidarity with the world. This is quite different from Levinas's and Dussel's conception. If Levinas presents the other as a break with this world held in common, Glissant stresses that approaching another should be an ethical practice that turns us toward the world. In other words, it is not a practice of religion, the term Levinas reserves for the ethical encounter, but of politics. And when I first read this line in Glissant's Traité du Tout Monde, how he reads in Burke's approach to Islam in ethics within a politics, an approach that turns us toward the world, I thought, yes, this is a translation, another way of saying what Cacique Marcos said to me. Share the story of the Shukuru and defend other struggles. In his activism, Marcos remains a strong defender of human rights. And for him, these rights claims start from situating human life in right relation to land. If, with Glissant's reading of Burke, this is a humanism, then it is not a Promethean humanism, stealing fire from the gods, nor is it a Protagorean humanism, with man as the measure of all things. No, this Shukuru humanism is a relative humanism, with humans situated as relative to a wider sacred around us. Something else that Glissant's concept of opacity does, when we read it in its full context as a rights claim, is suggest a dialogue with other rights claims across the Americas and the Caribbean. We can read Glissant's call for a right to opacity, a right to respect cultural difference, not just as what a standard tradition of rights would call a third-generation cultural right. We can also read the right to opacity as part of a much larger, largely non-academic, understudied archive of rights claims. We can read the claim forward, as I have suggested, in linking the right to opacity to the legal struggles of the Shukuru, and we can read it backward to understand and group together past struggles, as when the Peruvian journalist José Carlos Mariátegui asserted, "We are not content with demanding an indigenous right to education, culture, progress, love, and heaven. We start by categorically demanding their right to land." Here we see that Mariátegui, who articulated an original Marxism grounded in Latin American cultural and political realities, was not an indigenista. He aimed to shift the debate on indigenous people in Peru away from any question of their character or essence and toward the material conditions in which they lived and worked. After all, it was the ruling classes who wanted to describe indigenous people in terms of a backward or non-modern character, and who inflated cultural difference in order to avoid questions of material living conditions. Against this ontological turn, Mariátegui tried to reframe the key social problem of his time from a cultural and racial framing caught by the phrase el problema del indio to a socialist problematization of state-enforced capitalism that dispossessed indigenous peoples. In doing so, he was still sensitive to what he understood about indigenous conceptual creation. While he started from demanding a right to land, Mariátegui's transformative call for land redistribution was not simply based on European conceptions of land. Rather, in his concept of the territorial, most directly translated as territory, he had in mind senses not just of bounded geography, as the English word suggests, but also of history, narrative, culture, and popular memory. Reading Mariátegui with Glissant now, we can additionally note that the right Mariátegui gives precedence to, the right to land, aligns with the right to opacity in that it works to preserve cultural difference, but does so in a way very different from asserting either an easy cross-cultural understanding or doubling down on its impossibility. I read in Mariátegui's demand what Marcos's suggestion to me also implied, that there will be a lot, quite a lot probably, of cultural misunderstanding in our shared work in defense of indigenous land rights. And that misunderstanding, what Glissant calls opacity, is in fact a key part of political life. As we struggle alongside one another for land rights, we miss each other or harm each other, restore each other, make fun of each other and of ourselves. And all of this presupposes what those who follow Levinas's vocabulary struggle to account for, which is communication, a shared language, commensurability, or legibility. Opacity is about responsibility, yes, but as a rights claim, a politics of solidarity across difference, it presupposes misunderstanding, humor, care, injury, and mutual change and exchange. It also presupposes that knowledge is not supposed to be tied to any filiation. In other words, the ethics of relation I have been sketching in this talk moves away from framing the ethical as infinite obligation and moves beyond an identitarian logic of filiation. Read this way, Glissant gives us room to move or room to breathe in political and ethical life. And this leads me to my closing point, for which I will turn to literature. When I started writing my book on Glissant's right to opacity, I was thinking of a few things. I was still reading a lot of Dussel and Levinas, and by then I had in mind not just time in Brazil, but also Standing Rock in North Dakota, the largest gathering of indigenous people in this country in over 100 years. Something that impressed me about Standing Rock was that the call was open. Anyone was able to join as long as they were willing to follow a simple set of rules. No guns, no alcohol, and dress simply because this is a prayer camp. In other words, the invitation was not based on filiation or heritage. It was based on a willingness to orient yourselves to others and to land in a certain way. And so, when I started drafting Choose Your Bearing, I thought about how an inflation of difference, how the logic of race as a concept to divide humanity, was used most effectively by the pipeline company, which leveraged differences in ancestry, age, and religion to fragment fatigued activists in different camps. I was living in Minneapolis then, and in a frigid Minnesota February, I would spend much of my mornings writing, and then the rest of my days reading literature. And it was this constellation of rereading Dussel, reflecting on Brazil, thinking about Standing Rock, and writing about Glissant's Right to Opacity, that I started reading the novels of the Peruvian writer José María Arguedas as I took the bus around the city. This time, reading Arguedas would become more important to me than I understood then. Two moments have stayed with me most strongly. Like how Burke knew Arabic, Arguedas knew Quechua well. At the beginning of Los Rios Profundos, Arguedas tells the story of Ernesto as a boy walking through Cusco, searching for the Inca wall. In a moment of freedom, he breaks away from his father and runs to see the wall. Arguedas describes how Ernesto encounters the stones in this way, and this is the second quotation on your handout. I walked along the wall, stone by stone. I stepped back a few steps, contemplating it, and then stood closer again. I touched the stone with my hands. I followed the undulating line, unpredictable, like that of rivers, where the blocks of stone were joined. In the dark street, in the silence, the wall appeared to be alive. Ernesto goes on to speak of the rapport, corriente, between himself and the wall. When his father reaches the street where Ernesto ran off to, he hurries them along, but Ernesto says, "Papa, every stone is talking. Let's wait a moment," to which his father responds, "We won't hear anything. It's not that they're talking, you're just confused." And he suggests that they go to the nearby cathedral to pray. Most obviously, this is a moment about Ernesto's coming of age, about leaving behind the silliness of childhood in order to see the world as an authority figure says it really is. It is also a moment about competing traditions, how one form of the sacred and one form of prayer, here the Jesuit form, supplants the Inca form. Perhaps this moment of Arguedas has stayed with me because, on another day with the Shukuru, Cacique Marcos climbed onto the gate that separates Shukuru lands from the rest of the state of Pernambuco, and, from the gate, asked me to listen to the trees and told me that the trees were happy that I was there that day. But I could not hear what the trees were saying to me. Their saying remained opaque to me. In that moment, I was much more like Ernesto's father, who could not hear the stones. But I also remained like Ernesto in my belief that the stones could speak and that they, like the trees Marcos tried to present to me, carry lessons that would perhaps not necessarily remain opaque if I apprenticed myself over a long period of time to Shukuru philosophy, because all human knowledge is relatable, so traditions can be learned. But this learning, in addition to carrying with it tremendous responsibility, also requires a certain kind of space for thinking. And this brings me to the second moment in Arguedas. The second moment is from El Zorro, from Arguedas' third diary, when he is trying to finish the book he is writing. It is the final quotation on your handout. In Chile, I have found people like this. in whom the maximum university learning, the exceptional and cultivated intelligence, with the resources of several languages, not only does not create, but does not even let emerge a formalism. In Nelson's house, where everything was intrinsically in order, my body moved with a freedom never before known in the cities. Everything was at my disposal, especially the air that we breathe, because it is a lie that this air is so free and so purely owned by everyone. The air inside a foreign house, even with many friends, is alienated. The chest cannot take it in with the same joy or unconsciousness with which it breathes it in fields. Here Arguedas argues against the cliché that air is for everyone to breathe. In modern times, that is simply not the case, in that some people can afford to live in places where the air is not polluted, while others are redlined or pushed by poverty into neighborhoods with poisonous air. And in that soon, without changes in our laws, the air will not be safe for anyone to breathe. We know that coloniality marks not just the land and the law, not just the borders that turn away migrants or the concepts we have inherited, but also the air itself. This point reflects Arguedas' consistent attention to race and political economy. But that is not the only kind of air Arguedas is talking about here. He is also talking about the air that is shared in intellectual spaces. On my reading, he is worried about some of the formalism of academic life, but he also does not dismiss the importance of university learning, particularly across languages. In the lines around the passage I quoted, he sketches an informal and free mode of sharing knowledge and says that it is only through this informality that his body can move freely, that his lungs can take in the air and make it a part of his spirit and flesh. This air, as it were, is what allows us to move differently from how we usually move, how we are extremely conscious of our precarity, of when we cannot take a deep breath. For Arguedas, then, one definition of freedom would be marked by when we are unconscious of these legal and polluting pressures, because we have carved out spaces of care where they no longer weigh so strongly on us. I hope by now I can say that while I have presented a trajectory from ethics to politics, largely to present an alternative to how ethics has been theorized as involving transcendence in the philosophy of liberation, what is increasingly called decolonial philosophy, I hope I can say that my turn to literature is also a return to ethics, a return to those places and moments that, even if only for a few breaths, sustain human life beyond the categories and ideologies we live much of our lives caught in. I have tried to show that the stories Marcos shared with me, as well as the moments we spent in silence, exceed the legal bounds that the Brazilian state's anti-indigenous litigation put him in, trying to silence him from organizing, as well as to prevent him from having any time for his own silence and contemplation. In writing this way, while admittedly defending indigenous sovereignty, I am also imperfectly trying to hold open an imaginary or alternative beyond sovereignty, one that is lived out in the everyday. And this is the final way I'll offer my reading of The Right to Opacity, as political in the right and as allowing the possibility of an ethical alternative in the opacity. That is the generative aporia of the concept, and that is why I have told you about dive watches and riding the bus, and why I've told you about what I don't understand, what remains dark to me, about the stories Marcos shared. Arguedas' portrait of Ernesto at the wall is one of these everyday moments that exceed the light of juridical reason and the centrality of logos. The wall appears alive to him only in the dark street, in the silence. My sense is that these stories, prayers, and forms of study prefigure the alternative spaces that remain essential for us to cultivate in this century, where more and more of us feel out of place, alienated in some way, grasping for air, or struggling psychologically, as Arguedas deeply was. If from Levinas we gain the powerful reminder that human life starts from ethical life in response to another, if from Glissant we are counseled that this turn toward another should also turn toward the world and the political, it is from Arguedas that we are reminded of that ancient connection between the Greek word for spirit, life, or soul, psyche, and breath. We are reminded of our fundamental need for air, for informality, as we walk a demanding, but also potentially beautiful, ethical path, a path that both remains within and gestures beyond politics as we know it. Here my 20th century decolonial political vocabulary of sovereignty, rights, and the human can learn from deconstruction in the study of literature. Here it is helpful to step back and take perspective. To read these moments in Arguedas back into political philosophy is to ask philosophy to reunite with what it has most violently tried to separate from its claims to rationality. The prayer of a child who hears voices, or the acknowledgement that land and air influence reason. To practice philosophy this way, to listen to whatever strange voice philosophy speaks in, is also to make philosophy relative to the territorial that surrounds us. Such a mode of what I call ethics and Glissant calls relation, these strange forms of philosophy remain so needed in our times, where many of us still struggle to think beyond the categories of the nation and the hegemonic state. I wonder now if Marcos, in not only exemplifying human rights activism, but also introducing me to trees, was trying to teach me something that I only started to understand reading Arguedas on the bus during that cold Minnesota winter. That if the right to opacity situates ethics in a larger politics, then that politics too could be understood as relative to more important spheres of life. At its best, as Arguedas teaches us, politics is sustained by and allows us to return more joyfully to moments of ordinary life that exceed the political. These are the very moments in which we learn to live what Glissant called another dimension of humanity, one in which more and more of us might be able to move through this world more freely, with la misma alegría o inconsciencia that we would have in moving through the house of our dearest friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Then I think we have time for questions and comments. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your talk. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I suppose in some ways I'm still thinking through with essentially abstract and heavy material. But if I can just sort of draw on some of the very words that you use. So, it's for an ethic of difference in many ways that then you use, I suppose, in some ways, the metaphor of the air. So that when one has air, one has the capacity to breathe, and breathing, one can, I suppose, go breathe in, and therefore tolerate this sort of difference, which in itself is a sort of noble gesture. But you also invoke, if I read you correctly, the sort of rights discourse, and it's sort of tied into the right to breathe, the right to air, as that sort of ethical difference. I suppose just to stick with your language, how does one safeguard the right to breathe different air with a very legal system that tends to choke, but has its own sort of formalism in terms of how it works, often functioning on sort of binary language, right and wrong, moral and moral, legal and illegal. How would your noble sort of endeavor try to safeguard against a system that tends to choke?
I mean, I think, the safeguard question, I think a lot about Stuart Hall, and who's very sensitive to what you're saying, policing the crisis, but then reminds us that, in his phrase, politics without guarantees, is that the language we choose cannot safeguard a certain outcome. That is how we look at that idea. And so, for some, that's deflating, because would it be the case that we could somehow use the right concepts and avoid that violence? That would be ideal. And my sense is people more in search of that method are more sympathetic to the Levinasian approach, looking for something outside of Rising's course or some contaminated language. I think Stuart Hall says, well, the world is increasingly diasporic. There is not a concept not marked by history. So then the question becomes strategic. Which imperfect, limited concept, like all other concepts, could best achieve the ends we're trying to reach? It's however you call it. He talks about this, in Cultural Studies 1983, with respect to rights and the rule of law, even. I think the penultimate lecture was called. So my approach is really following Stuart Hall. Rights language cannot safeguard, but is a tool that remains broadly legible and is a starting point for organism, much in the way that it's not that the rights claims and standing up in my reading or the sugar reading fully exhaust their political imaginary, to say the least, but at least could bring together a wider coalition, wider media attention. It might not be successful. Oil is flowing to the Dakota, but still could bring people together, lead to different ramifications that are maybe not in the direct context. Whether that's more,
Sean, Max,
Thank you. This is really interesting. So I don't know if I have one question or two, but so you ended on this idea of stepping back, and you started out with opacity. Seems to me. It seems to me there's some tension, right? Because the point of stepping back is to be able to see, is to be able to create some transparency, create some legibility. I mean, in some ways, there's a deeper philosophical point here about interaction, practice, possibility of change, and how perfect transparency or perfect obscurity both would make that impossible. So you need something in between, like obscurity, it seems to me, just for social interaction or something like that, right? But what I was what I was curious about is maybe more about how stepping back or stepping forward, what might be the difference, and how, it seems like part of what's at stake, with this Levinasian, or just in modernity, the way that we think about questions of ethics in politics very often have to do with some sort of reified kind of conception of truth, rather than having recourse to, how practice might confirm, the efficacy or goodness of some kind of political orientation or something like this. So I'm curious about how practice versus reason might relate to obscurity, but then also maybe how related to this somehow, although I would have to I don't know that I'm going to convince you that these are related, but it seems to me that obscurity also sort of mediates a kind of resource for power, right? Because when everyone else is transparent, then there's a certain advantage that one has. By the same token, one's own obscurity or has a certain power. At the same time, like I was recently reading Du Bois's like this speech that he gave on aesthetics, and so like one of the one of the means for racial dominance was creating obscurity of Black society by sort of like mismapping it somehow in like white culture or something like this, in movies and novels and things like this. So I'm curious about like the politics of obscurity and how they relate to practice. Sorry, that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think the stepping back, I am trained in philosophy. This is less of a issue in continental theory around policing what counts as philosophy and kind of things. But there, I was just sort of trying to invite a reflection that in a landscape dominated by Anglo-American philosophy, literature has some interesting things to say on moments that I think of as philosophical. I think less relevant as an intervention here. That's all I was really thinking, stepping back. These moments in a wider professional conversation. Obscurity, I'm intense about translating opacity as opacity. Glissant says in Poetics of Relation that opacity is not obscurity.
Yeah.
And
No, I found that convincing. Yeah.
okay. I mean, but for precisely reasons, I don't know, maybe we think of this somewhat differently, I think about Du Bois's writings in the 40s, because you mentioned Du Bois, where he says in Calling Democracy 45 that if there's obscurity, it's because, he has that chapter in Calling Democracy about what is a colony. Sort of saying, well, it remains obscure to us, we don't know. Not because we can't know it, but because of how information has been kept by colonizing countries that has to do with resources more than the well-being of the people in human existence. And then, following that, in 47, his speech, Human Rights for All Minorities, he talked about practice and feelings in extremely material ways. My reaching for coffee or clothes or deeply tied to others who are not somehow unknowable, obscure to us. They are entangled in material everyday sense. And that's how I have come to read the world of these things. Or Stuart Hall, who says, I am the sugar in your tea. That's not obscurity, as I read,
Yeah.
So I think there's a responsibility there that I worry about, like form, for instance, the form of writing that comes from following the obscurity line. Glissant, some people tell me, well, Glissant does that. I said, okay, fair.
Sorry, just real quick. So, but what I understood from what you were saying is that opacity is somewhere between obscurity and transparency. Or a combination of two.
Yeah, I like it for the difference, the sense of difference, but this is why I am also at pains to say right to opacity. Because if we just stay with the opacity, which lots of literature does, then quickly the tendency is often to ontologize.
Yeah.
The difference, which is very common in contemporary theory as far as their show. And I don't know exactly why that is. It seems to be circulating a lot on academic texts, whereas non-academics, we don't study as much. Martinican, Claudia Jones, use rights language in a more political vocabulary that creates the conditions of defending the difference. This is how I kind of think of it. So, for instance, I may not understand Shukuru metaphysics or Shomi metaphysics, but I can make rights claims as a citizen with respect to, or as a activist with respect to a company like Nestle trying to control water rights for water, which is of course tied to culture. So I'm thinking, okay, not so much obscurity and transparency, but opacity. My concern is more now not making it another alterity or saying it's obscure, but instead recognizing a sense of difference that I may not understand, but could still defend in practice. Are we getting closer?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, my comment and question. So if I understand correctly, where you want to go is basically to show us opacity as what makes possible or even necessary relations, to have relations. There are two possible ways to go, and the question is how we qualify these relations. Two ways to go is one is if I remember correctly, Tolerant in this book on the conquest of America, there's a page in which he probably listed something around 6, 7, 8 different languages. Most of them are indigenous languages. And his point is that what happens in these languages is the same thing that happened in ancient Greek, that basically the people who don't speak Greek are barbarous. There is no connection with them. So and Todorov said, in many languages, they are dumb. They don't speak, they don't talk, there is no communication. So in that case, opacity becomes obscurity, becomes a wall, becomes a barrier. And also the question is how you turn this possible obscurity into opacity, something that makes possible relations. My first impulse is to say that to go in that direction, before I give my answer, let me second vignette, second possibility is this is Benjamin, our translation. Benjamin would have said that when a language or a culture encounters another culture or another languages, what you get is in the practice of a translation that you change both languages. So basically, when languages or culture encounter each other, they share something. This is where I want to go. They share something, but what they share is actually the practice of changing each other. So this relationship is a relation in which something happens for all the elements which are implied in this new form of relation. The opacity remains, but the opacity becomes, in a certain way, the condition of possibility for changing all the elements. So what is interesting, if you go in that direction, is that the category that is required to overcome obscurity is the category of universality. That is not a concept, but is a practice. Is something that takes place it basically is equal to change. So is a practical dimension in which communication, opacity, interaction is possible because you are open to this transformation and change. Even if you're not open, something happens in the practice of the translation. So in a certain way, it's just what I try to move is the concept of universality toward change, reciprocal change. But at the same time, what I want to say is that you need these categories of universalities in order to overcome obscurity. If you don't have this possible universality, there is no reason why I should try to approach the barbarous, the dumb, someone who doesn't speak.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't recall how much Simone talks about this. Dussel certainly wants to reclaim barbarism as a positive, no longer an insult, but a value that's good.
So did Benjamin. He has a positive barbarism at a certain point. But
I think, one of the few examples that I'm more sympathetic to just sort of difference as political. So just opacity, not the right to opacity, is about language. And begged, and I forget which book, notes that some missionaries talked about the Americas as a forest of language that really hindered their popularization. And that would maybe there's the differences. Staying as obscurity, I am such a kind of, thinking with Vico and Said, we make things, humans make things. And so we can understand them. That I don't know if we need, maybe, I don't know if we're saying the same things or different things, because I would say on that understanding with Vico, I don't know if we need a concept to even get past obscurity or whatever. Obscurity is, I don't know, a lack of effort on my part or something, to learn what has been made, how it has been made, that I could remake, but also I could just learn. Can you help me out?
Yeah, I would say, maybe what my question, in a more or less provocative way, is that even the concept of the obscurity requires some universality. There's a kind of a post-change term, post-encounter, in which the change took place already, and then the obscurity has already become opacity. It's something that is that can allow relations, that can allow communication, and that can keep open this process of mutual change and transformation. So, in a certain way, the idea of opacity implies some universality. Or one can say, if Todorov is right, it's already kind of a post-encounter idea. That and it is a good idea that can be developed and used for whatever purpose. But so I think it's important to point out the relationship between opacity and universality, because so you say that a risk is ontology, another risk is to be dismissive about everything sound too universal, because it's very common today to say that the universal equals Eurocentric.
Yeah.
But universal in this case is actually the openness of the opacity.
Yeah, I think, okay, so I'm hearing you. I think
I read it similarly. Relation as a concept responds to a post-change context. And there is that universality in English song in the two modes, seven idols of voice. So absolutely. However, I also think he also said, in giving examples for opacity, it could be the fact that he doesn't like broccoli.
He doesn't like
broccoli.
Uh-huh.
So he's opaque to himself in that way. That's a much less, political, historical understanding of the term. And as far as I read it, it might not be post-contact either.
Yeah.
Because it's just, I'm a stranger to myself in that way. Yeah.
This is my 12-year-old daughter.
It's what?
My 12-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
But with broccoli.
She thinks that all she can eat is like pizza and chocolate. But she refuses to have the encounter.
She's okay to herself.
She
No
knows
encounter.
No, I can't.
She's a kind of colonist.
Oh, they all.
But I think that would be an interesting reading of opacity that hasn't been taken up as much, though. And I think would follow some of what I read as Glissant's humanism. That's not just about the big, contact between cultures. And that kind of found from Césaire in discourse, genuine contact. But it could also be parent-child. It could also be, to myself. I don't know how many people have written that. That'd be interesting to find.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I have a few thoughts. Maybe one clarification question, and then two things that your talk made me think about, and I want to kind of throw them back at you. The first one is the question. It is about the opaque, and I think I'm picking up on how you define it. There's something there that I'm not like completely getting, I feel like. And I'm thinking specifically of two modalities of more recent engagement with colonial histories and politics. So one would be the slightly older post-colonial discourse, where ultimately it came down to a kind of celebration of multiplicity, multiculturalism, hybridity, fluidity. I'm thinking of like Onibaba, and that kind of confluence in infinite sort of like passage of cultures.
Yeah.
And then the more recent decolonial term, where the idea is more of an, claim to create an absolute separation, an epistemic rupture, decolonization, like a elimination, almost a kind of purity of the two, the colonial and colonized. So I take it that with Glissant and with Mariátegui, you are trying to create a third path. Maybe, or this is how I was trying to situate what you're doing in my head. With the idea of the opacity of the human, that is also tied to certain material claims. What I want to know more about regarding this opacity, though, is whether it's opaque. The human is opaque, but we could know it if we tried. With years of, immersion, cultural exchange, mutual transformation, as Max was saying, that we can eventually understand it. Or the opacity is something regarding the undefinability of the human, that we couldn't even know it even if we tried really hard with an open mind to know it, because there is no human essence, because that idea of the human is changing historically, geographically, culturally, but also our conception of what the human is, our representation of what the human is also changing. And therefore it is undefinable, or better to leave it at that, and therefore that is the opacity. So,
Yeah.
so I don't know, if you could maybe, I mean, I've created polls that are not necessarily yours,
Yeah.
but just, you
Yeah,
know,
I understand.
translate for me where you might situate your definition of opacity in relation to these polls, perhaps. And then the more, I don't know how relevant these are, but the two other things that I was thinking about while listening to you, first, it reminded me of Althusser's critique of ideology's transparency. The ideology that presents itself as transparent, you know, like in Reading Capital, the famous introduction where he talks about how one pretends to read nature as it is, all the while, obviously, your unspoken assumptions are masqueraded as universal truth. Whereas then the task of the thinker or the materialist or the Marxist, I don't know how you would define it, but is to do that work of ideology critique, to make what is apparently transparent, but in fact opaque, more visible, more understandable. So I guess I'm wondering if that's the kind of attitude then that one must have toward this opacity, a kind of ideology critique, or, you know, like an attempt to, you know, because this is kind of the reversal of that. It's not an assumption of transparency, but then the opposite assumption. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I was reminded, listening to you, of Audra Simpson's concept of ethnographic refusal, where indigenous communities and researchers working with indigenous communities assume or agree not to reveal certain things or to leave it opaque, precisely in order to be able to avoid or undermine the colonizer's gaze and knowledge. So, like the politicization of a kind of opacity in terms of the production of knowledge about indigenous peoples, and how that knowledge gets absorbed into circuits of the Western academia or Anglophone academia, to kind of like create some roadblocks. I think that is a really interesting concept. So I wondered if that was relevant to you or what you thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, though not my polls, I'm more or less thinking along the lines you suggested between the hybridity and the decolonial. It's a difference. There is a philosopher at Chicago, who is reading Glissant in an interesting way with respect to this question, starting from some of the posters in Black Lives Matter marches that white people often have that said something like, "I understand that I'll never understand." And this philosopher's response, reading Glissant, was one limitation of that when we approach to another is that it could avoid the work that reading literature, reading history, having conversations with another might entail. One can just say, well, I could never understand, and I certainly don't want to get what Glissant's calling comprehension, so I will just announce that I can't understand this difference. And this philosopher, I'm sympathetic to this, said, that's not the route we particularly follow. Glissant, that there still needs to be seeking out at least that sense of history that leads to what Glissant calls entanglement. So this is to your does opacity mean eventually understand or ultimate undefinability? Because I am thinking here with a sense of philosophical practices, I certainly lean toward the eventual understand side. But I hear in your question also maybe almost like a sense of philosophical anthropology. Can we ultimately know these, And I think that's helpful because maybe it's a sense of history, a sense of entanglement, a sense of language, cultural practices. Like Glissant said at the end of his life, he laments that he doesn't know Arabic because he can't read Dervish poetry. So that seems to be eventual understanding in some way. But the broccoli line suggests to me more the ultimate unknowability, even of ourselves.
You just getting old.
Or getting old. I'm very sympathetic to the ethnographic refusal, politics of refusal. I hear the rights to men similarly there. Perhaps it could mean academically a right not to be studied or something, which leads to maybe an important addition to Max's question that has to do with how the relation comes about. For instance, whether it's by invitation to study something. So I think that's an absolute fair connection. The ideology critique part, I'm not sure I'm fully understanding the question, is that the opacity is in service of this critique, or incompatibility with that line?
I guess the ideology critique is directed at showing the let's say opaque underbelly of what presents itself as transparent.
Yeah.
And not being transparent.
Yeah.
Like when something presents itself as being opaque, how does that work then?
Right.
Is that still even a track that can be taken? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
How do we develop that job very much, but I was hoping you could.
Well, what it makes me think of.
We have 4 other questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
would like to have a dialogue as well, but I think it's so we have Robert, Mingui, Guillermo, and Philip. So Robert.
Hello. Thank you. So first of all, my apologies for not being able to be there in person. I was just recently in contact with someone who tested positive for COVID. So out of kind of abundance of caution, I'm not in the room with you today. But thanks for visiting us. I have 2 questions, and I apologize also if they overlap a little with some of the conversation. It's a little harder to hear the conversation itself than your talk was very clear, but some of the back and forth I didn't pick up on, so I apologize if I'm repeating a point that others have made. I have 2 basic questions. The first question picks up on a phrase that you used in one of the responses to one of the questions, which is a stranger to myself. So the first question just has to do about clarifying kind of the strength of the kind of claim that you want to make. If I understand it, the basic thrust of it, which I'm very sympathetic to, is that the discourse of alterity and the trajectory that runs from Levinas to Dussel tends to emphasize the idea that we cannot really fully understand another, and you want to push back. The weaker claim is that understanding is possible across difference, or perhaps even because of difference, through the notion of opacity. But the stronger claim is that it is only understanding by way of another that allows me to understand myself. That we can't understand ourselves precisely because we are too proximate to ourselves, and that in a sense it is only another who can understand me. And that this basic idea, it seems strangely obscure to me from the Levinasian Dussel tradition. It seems to me so fundamental, for instance, to the whole psychoanalytic tradition, that I am least capable of understanding myself precisely because I'm too proximate to myself. That is why I need another. The other is much more likely to understand me than I am to understand myself, right? So one of the lines I love from Lacan is where he says, he's playing off the Christian injunction that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. What's wrong about that is that people don't love themselves. It's a fundamentally mistaken injunction. So there's a kind of epistemological version of that if the Levinasians say you should know another as you would know yourself, the stronger claim is we do not know ourselves. We are fundamentally opaque to ourselves. And so it is more likely that through difference, because difference has a comparative context, so it allows you to see something about yourself you can't see without it. So there's something very central to I think the psychoanalytic tradition about that idea, but also, of course, the whole tradition that runs through Hegel that would say the self-consciousness is precisely not an interiority inside oneself through a process of reflection of the self upon itself in a solipsistic manner, but to get away from that whole tradition of solipsism and to think about self-consciousness as a social practice that requires difference in order to make itself clear to itself. So I'm just curious whether you would adopt the stronger claim. It's not just that alterity, that understanding is possible with alterity, but understanding is only possible through alterity, and that proximity and solipsism incline towards self-deception. And a corollary of that, I would say, even is that it is precisely because of this possibility of self-deception or self-opacity that justice, if we want to move into the political realm, justice cannot be deference to the other. It can't be just respect for the other as the other understands him or herself, precisely because each of us inclines to self-deception, to simply defer to or respect another person in their own terms without challenging them or criticizing them, is not to incline towards justice, but exactly to compound the problem of self-deception. Just a little anecdotal example of that, I always think of comes from Book 1 of Plato's Republic, where Polemarchus says that justice is giving to another what is owed him, and Socrates says, well, what if a person is insane with rage and he wants his sword back? Is it right to give to someone what they want if they themselves are self-deceived or self-obscured, right? So there's that the whole possibility of justice arises from the problem that justice cannot be just deference to the other on their own because we do not know ourselves. So that's kind of my first question, is like, how strong a version of that would you adopt? My second question comes from a half-remembered thing about Glissant that I'm curious whether I've remembered it correctly and what you think. So I remember reading Caribbean Discourse, and the English translation of it translates le droit à l'opacité both as the right to opacity and as the right to obscurity. And I always thought that was so interesting and strange. And you would think, well, on the one hand, that's just a mistake, because, of course, obscurity can mean incommensurability or incomprehensibility, but it can also mean like insignificance. One can slide into obscurity, as in to being forgotten, to being irrelevant. And that seemed to me to be an entry point, that mistaken translation seem to me to be like an entry point into the problem of power and the fetishizing of alterity as prohibiting the building of collective power, and thus the slide into obscurity, if you see what I mean. And that's different, I think, than just the question of like ethics, because it's a question of power. And it's already contained, I think, also in the idea of a right to opacity, because if a right is anything, it's some kind of enforceable claim. So if you want to claim a right to opacity, you need to have a story about how you're going to build power, and that requires building across differences, building collectives, and so on. So that kind of slippage in the translation of a right to opacity versus a right to obscurity seemed to me to be accidentally putting its finger on the problem of building power and its connection to the very notion of a right.
To the first, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. No, I think it's the stronger claim, both because Glissant was, very influenced by psychoanalysis and personally as well, and reading Hegel. But also he says that in Poetics of Relation, there's pretty clear textual evidence that is the stronger claim. Or at least that relation another can allow one to know oneself much more robustly. So I think it's the stronger. And yes, I've learned a lot from Michael Dash's work. My copy of Caribbean Discourse is mostly just reminding myself in the margins of kind of sticking to the original terms, so I don't get lost in obscurity or mixture, so I can track the capitalizations. So yeah, while I have learned a lot from Michael Dash's writing on Glissant, I am a bit lost by the English, because I do think and that's a much abridged version also. He has huge sections of Haiti and much more elaboration on the Martinican elite and so on in the French. So yeah, that's an unfortunate that it happened that way. That leads to, I think, probably many more readings of obscurity in Glissant than his writing indicates. Also because, we go to Caribbean Discourse because it's arguably the most clearly political in a certain understanding of politics. And then we run into this obscurity problem that I think I completely agree leads to all sorts of problems with respect to building power or coalition or however you want to say it. So, yeah.
Mingui.
Thank you for a beautiful talk. And I could tell there's a certain poetic dimension in your talk, especially when you said, you said for us reading the song. It almost feels like you're saying that, we should go out and do something, kind of call. I think your talk is very interesting in the sense that you take on the whole literature of translation, bilingualism, biculturalism. It's a different angle. And I think both Max and Robert touched on this. And the way I understand Max is he argues against incommensurability very strongly. But what you are saying is that a little bit of incommensurability is used in political struggle. And that's why, in a way, you want to retain language capacity, or maybe Glissant, and this kind of level of incommensurability in order to use it as a conceptual weapon in political struggle. That is interesting, and I think there was a tradition of social movements taken that line to, for example, there's indigenous people in Taiwan, and I hang out with them sometimes, and they find along this line,
Okay.
the certain level of incommensurability is really useful. Okay, you cannot just dismiss them as cultural relatives. And that sort of usefulness in political struggle is what I get from you, and that is very interesting to me. My question is not about that. My question is about the transcendence, since I sort of, as I understood you, right? So you are saying that then transcendence is too heavy, maybe it's too burdensome to a lot of this indigenous struggle. Therefore, informality is good, right? In a university too heavy, we are talking about those theories that may not be useful for those struggling science. So, so my curiosity is that, do you just want to throw the transcendence out of yourself?
Yeah.
Careful, Simone Weil is. You have a book on Simone Weil. That's it. I'm curious.
No, I appreciate your reading of keeping how you said it, a little incommensurability.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
No, I'd be interested in hearing more about the example you note in Taiwan, because I think the oil companies and pipeline companies are very good at exacerbating certain fault lines that don't necessarily have to be fault lines. Transcendence, well, I'm reminded that, William James said philosophy is a question of temperament. And temperamentally, as Max is hinting into, I like a little transcendence.
A little bit incommensurability.
A little
transcendence.
A little broccoli.
Yeah, I am vegetarian. But, but I worry, how to say it. There are other ways, other words people have used, particularly to Banu's kind of third way question, the post-colonial attention to what the decolonial people have called whatever, this transcendence. Perhaps there's a healthy reminder from the post-colonial line that this could also be fetish, or an exoticism, or Orientalism. So that's partly informing my worry. Why would we say and get rid of transcendence? But if I'm not seeing vocabulary, maybe by impulse, I find it quite helpful. The starting from a demand of another, which also somewhat returns us to Bonner's question citing Hunter Simpson around when to use rights language, when not to. Ideally, that might, or your initial question, that might be less a response to pontificate about, and more depending deeply on the context and the invitation and the specific struggle, and what, starting from another who makes a request or something like this. If that's what transcendence is, that priority, whatever it is. I'm okay with that. It's the prayerful relation that's not a dialogue over what you were calling reciprocity that is more of my work. Even if secretly I'm pro-transcendence.
Just some marginal comments.
I'm very provoking your paper, your ideas. I was just thinking about this issue of opacity further as a challenge to how do we engage with the rest of the world, right? Nowadays, also in relationship to nature. And remembering a little bit of what Enrique Luce also has been focusing on by looking at Latin America, New World, etc. If we remember, he brings the notion of better calling the process uncovering rather than discovering.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in Arguedas, who I met in Santiago de Chile in 1969, in his works, there is a beautiful character, and I congratulate you for bringing philosophy and literature. There's a character, right? There's a woman, and this is, twisting words here, because in Quechua, the term opa, right, who is the person, this character, woman character in Arguedas, is mute. And sort of people also consider her insane, right? But she's observing everything, and she's the one that, passes on information and clarifies information in her own ways, beyond language, right? And so when the term opacity came, I said, I couldn't, but think about the term, right? But in this case, switching into English, right? And this twist, of how language and revelation and opacity and obscurity come to be, right? I love it.
Thank you. A good reminder about usual in invention in Americas. And that's a very helpful example of opacity also, and your clarification of different ways that she still communicated. So not necessarily obscure or that there's no relation, but in a practical way.
Also, initial encounter, this historical narrative of how Atahualpa and Spanish come together. Their languages and not understandable. They are not. It's not language. They are not words. They are noises. They say, and further deepening the incommunication between these two, which has been the concern of Arguedas in talking from Mariátegui.
No, it's true, and I don't. Although I'm somewhat critical of this very narrow ethical, Leninasian inheritance of Duso, I agree with your opening point about his importance for shifting the geography of reason. Lewis was and drawing attention to other conceptual creations. Thinking of the philosophy of liberation as a distinctly Latin American philosophy like pragmatism.
Good. Okay. Thank you for your talk. I had this reflection based on your talk, and then it only grew with every question about particular term that was here and there, but perhaps as a kind of open-ended question or a comment, I could give it to you and hear from you how would you try to problematize it. It seems to me that in your work and also in the work of the authors you base it on, the question of translation is at the very opaque center of it all. in a very sense, also opacity and the practice of translation in a certain way presuppose each other all the time. Also, to refer to what Max Tomba said, and to his book about insurgent universalities, but also to Anna Singh's books, Much at the End of the World, especially. The question of universality also, I feel like, is very much concerned with the question of translation. In Anna Singh's book, she writes pretty clearly that capitalism can be thought as a system of translation in different patches, worlds, universalities. Yeah. And in order to kind of go beyond it, we need to form different practice of translation. Perhaps one that would not treat those different particularities, those universalities, as something transparent, but rather as something opaque that needs this processual work of translation.
Yeah.
And this also touches upon the question of universality versus universalities and the insurgency in all of it.
Yeah.
As you've mentioned with the Black Lives Matter protesters, I feel as, events like these are the moments where certain universalities can end and we begin only through this practice of translation, contrary to what the sign said, right? Those are the only moments when this translation and solidarity can bring out new universality. So that was like my idea about, and the very fact that you try to with this song to have this idea of how to connect ethics with politics and solidarity. I feel as if the very question of the ethics of the translation is at the basis of all of it.
Yeah. I think to use Bun's framework, I think of the translation question as the never finished, never fully achieved, ongoing. That has to do with what Rob said also about maybe the psychoanalytic register. And not just as an ethical burden or something, but it can be rewarding. There's pleasure involved to that kind of learning. But the one that has a clearer stoppage is the rights question. I think to your return to Black Lives Matter, there was a referendum in Minneapolis when the police that lost somewhat significantly. And I haven't quite put it together yet, but I think it might be because there were, say, to go back to Stuart Hall, engaging in political life, you don't get to choose your terrain. And that terrain is not ideal. And so then I wasn't in Minneapolis at this time, but my reading of the situation, talking to people I knew and who were doing a lot of advocacy work in churches and different things, we may have focused a bit more on the opacity and less on the relation, because in that referendums kind of is a victory if you are a democratic thinker, and then there's work to be done around consciousness raise and answering people's questions. Well, if someone breaks into my house, or I have a previous partner who's violent, in my current imaginary of solving this through militarized police, strikes me that we still have the task of having to answer those questions, because that's the terrain. That's how I feel.
Since we have 10 more minutes, I was asking how the question.
Great.
So, and that question is possible because all the other questions and comments. So the question is basically, what if the opaque, what we call the opaque, is actually not the other? The other is incommensurable. I cannot know the other. That's it. But the opaque is what is possible to have in common in order to have relations with others. So basically, the transcendence is located at the level of there is something that we can have in common, and that makes possible to have some relations. But in that case, I can understand the stones better.
Yeah.
The stones can talk. They have a voice because what you have in common is the territory. If the territory is the common, there is a room for opacity, and the stones are part of what we share in common. In capitalism, that common, what Marx would have called das Gemeinsam, and what we share is a completely transparent, because Marx would have said is value. So we can exchange commodities because they share something that is transparent, is value. So you have this universal equivalent money, and you exchange things. And basically, capitalism in that case destroys the opacity and destroys the very possibility and the difficulty of building something in common, of building real relations. We become fungible. We can buy relations, and we don't have concrete relations because of this excess of transparency.
Yeah.
Whereas, whereas I would say is opacity is a good way to take care of the difficulty of relations, of having something in common. And I think it's more about the relation than the terms of the relation. It's for me, it's pretty clear that you are obscured. I don't know it. I don't know my wife. She's obscure.
Don't go there, Mike.
Okay. So I don't know myself, as Robert said. I don't know myself, as Robert said. And for that reason, I don't know anybody else.
Right.
Could I ask something to this question real quick? Is that okay?
Sure.
Well, yeah, because it seems that part of what's at stake there too is the ability to produce transcendence in a certain way, right? Like at the point where everything becomes transparent, then there's no shared means for, you don't need any kind of transcendental object because it's all right there in front of you or whatever, right? So I'm curious about that was a specific question. Yeah,
I don't think we don't produce transcendence. Our problem is how you deal with the sum that transcends what you are and what you are. And that is something that transcends our own identity is what we have in common. So in common, we have something opaque, something that we cannot really address. But it is exactly for that reason that we need each other and we are in relation with each other because of our constitutive incompleteness.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that you need practices by which you have to articulate something towards something in order for those relations to make any sense. And so they need this like vertical dimension, right?
Yeah.
Like you need like something that's at stake, that isn't completely clear in order for people to articulate relations through practices to create like some sort of hierarchy, right? Otherwise, if it's all flat, then like because it's all clear, there's nothing to do. You just like turn the machine.
Yeah. Sure. And probably sometimes historically, even think about the Greeks. probably the barbarians kicked the Greeks in the ass so that the Greeks had to understand that maybe they have something in common with them, or it's better for them to have something in common. So at least they can understand what the barbarians had to say to them.
Yeah.
And in that case, the barbarians were even the Romans.
Yeah.
Who eventually colonized the Greeks. So it's a history of violence. So what I want to say, it took a lot of historical work and violence to become opaque to each other and not just obscure. There is an historical dimension in how the term opacity can work. It's started working. And probably the Bible says something about that. It's the Babel Tower.
Yeah. Yeah, which Glissant writes about. Yeah.
Yeah. You build it, you have the universal, and God said, no, this is not the right one.
Yeah.
You have to work to build the universal, and you have the many languages, you have the differences. It's not just that, you have now you have the power. No way.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to it.
Theology.
I mean, I was recently talking to international lawyers who, to say the least, are not particularly impressed by the immediate relevance of this rights claim for international law. It's not very clear, but what
It's okay to them.
it is certainly evaluated. I think that's something of a strength because it leaves us with the need for a learning process that might have to do with, even if the territory, we agree that the territory is in common, there still might be a new way, if you go like I did, to relearn how to listen to the stones that could be like, articles or title under periods in potential history. Perhaps Glissant leaves us with that educational task.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you for the
Thank you so much.